constant theme, if you like, a leitmotif in what I'm going to say, is that we must take Zionism seriously. It's not just sort of hot air. It is a program, a project, accompanied with an ideology that has been operative and has been so far successful, although it has encountered problems that were foreseeable and in fact foreseen. And I'm going to explain how all this has led to the present situation. I will not go into detail of current events, but take a look at them from a broad historical perspective in a way which I hope will clarify the historical trend and logic of a very long-term conflict. Now, recent elections in Israel have brought to power an ultra-extremist government. And it has put on the table, it has formulated and proposed two big packages of legislation, which amount to two major transformations in a direction that one of them concerns internal governance of Israel. The other concerns the Israeli colonization process and domination of the Palestinian territories. I will not go to discuss the former, that is to say, the package of legislation concerning the internal governance of Israel itself. I will just mention that it has been characterized by some Israeli commentators as a move towards fascism. I don't think the term fascism is particularly appropriate for these transformations. They are generally in the direction of right-wing populism. But as one of the most perceptive commentators in Israel, in Haaretz, actually characterized them, I'm referring to Daniel Blattman, who is an expert on populism, on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. He pointed out that unlike the fairly gradual process of introducing anti-liberal legislation in places like Poland or Hungary, what faces Israel is a very rapid move to extreme right-wing populism, similar to in pace of changes, and similar to what occurred, for example, in Germany in 1933. He's not comparing Netanyahu to Hitler, but it's simply the pace of changes that is being proposed is more like the pace that occurred in Germany in 1933, when the Nazi party won free elections and went over within a few months to transform the whole governance of Germany in a direction which is well known. So the pace that is facing Israel in this direction is similar to this. I also want to mention that a very significant fact you may have been reading in the British press and in other media about very big demonstrations in Israel against the proposed transformation. They are really on quite a big scale. But what is very significant is that these demos are confined to the package of legislation concerning the internal governance of Israel, the anti-liberal, anti-democratic package of legislation. They let me just enumerate some of them in very brief headline. Wholesale McCarthyistic laws, attack on democratic rights, government control of the judiciary, education, media, moves in the direction of theocracy. This is something unique to this, which is not quite like the situation in Hungary, more like, I mean, if you can compare it, it's more like India, where Hinduism is part of the package of right-wing populism. They also include very extreme anti-worker, anti-union legislation. Extreme legislation against the freedom to strike, which goes much further than what the conservative government is contemplating in this country. But these have been the subjects of the big demonstrations. What is missing and what is significant is that there is very little protest, or only by very small groups, against the other package of legislation. The package of, let us say, turbocharging the colonization of the Palestinian territories, intensification of the harsh, oppressive practices and murderous activities of the various Israeli armed forces and civilians who are settlers who join in these practices and are going to be empowered by the proposed new legislation. And the reason why the big demonstrations do not refer to these latter elements of legislation, to the package of intensification of Israeli domination and colonization of Palestinian territories, is because the majority of the opposition actually agrees with these trends, if not in the intensity which is being proposed, at least in principle. I repeat the catchword that I introduced before: take Zionism seriously. It is not just hot air. All the Jewish parties, including all the Jewish parties in opposition, are explicitly Zionist, in that Zionism is included in their programs. They are committed programmatically to Zionism. This applies to all Jewish parties except the two ultra-Orthodox parties, which are actually members of the present coalition, ruling coalition. However, these don't have Zionism in their program because traditionally in the past they used to be rather iffy, rather, let us say, suspicious of Zionism, and some at some point even opposed to some elements of Zionism, but they have been moving in the direction of Zionism over the last few years. So if not programmatically, at least in practice, they are, of course, committed. But this also applies to the Jewish parties in opposition, to the main opposition party, Yesh Atid, There Is a Future, and to the other Zionist parties, including the Labour Party and Meretz, the so-called left-wing Zionist party, which has failed to achieve any seats in the present Knesset. Now, when I'm talking about Zionism, what do I actually mean by this? Fortunately, we have a very good, very succinct formulation in the basic guidelines of the present government. Now, the basic guidelines of an Israeli government is the Israeli equivalent to the King's Speech. It is the program, the outline of a program of legislation that the incoming government puts on the table as part of its program of legislation in the coming period. The first sentence in this basic text of basic guidelines is the following: the Jewish people has an exclusive and indisputable right to all parts of the land of Israel. The government will promote and develop the settlement of all parts of the land of Israel in the Galilee, the Negev, the Golan, that includes the Golan, and Judea and Samaria, that's the West Bank. Not the Golan. They don't propose to, at the moment, to colonize the Gaza Strip, because that would be very problematic. Israel has withdrawn from the Gaza Strip in 2006 and put it under siege since then. But I want to point out an apparently trivial point. I have amended the translation, the English translation of this first sentence from the one you'll find in the internet. The text that you find in the internet reads, "The Jewish people have an exclusive and indisputable right," etc. I've amended it to "the Jewish people have an exclusive and indisputable right," because this corresponds to the Hebrew original. In the Hebrew original, the equivalent of the Hebrew equivalent of the word people is in the singular. Now, confusingly, and this is just in parentheses, the English word people has two meanings. One is as a plural noun, as the plural form of person. The plural of person in normal English is people. But people also has in English a singular meaning. That is to say, as a collective, something like a nation. Now, the word that is used in Hebrew is a singular, Ha'am HaYehudi. Unfortunately, the translation was probably performed by Google, and Google does not recognize the singular meaning of people. I've tried it. This is just a trivial aside. I've taken sentences in Hebrew, French, and Latin, which refer to people in a singular. The Jewish people is a chosen people, okay? I've written it in English and translated it using Google, and asked Google to translate it into Hebrew, French, and Latin. In each of these three cases, it translated it correctly in the singular form, le peuple, ha'am, populus in Latin. But then when I reverse the translation, right, you can reverse, in Google Translate, you can reverse the translation. The English equivalent came out in the plural. Okay, so now this seemingly trivial point is not really trivial, because what this point refers to is not individual rights of Jewish people in the plural, but a claim for exclusive national right of the Jewish people as a collective over all parts of the land of Israel. Okay, now this is a claim for an exclusive national right to the whole of the land of Israel, which includes all the West Bank and the Golan. And in fact, this basic guideline of the present coalition is a point of more or less a consensus of all Zionist parties, which means that the totality of all Jewish parties in Israel. I want to point out two aspects of this claim: totality and exclusivity. The claim is over the whole of the land of Israel. Now, what is the whole of the land of Israel? This is somewhat flexible. In the past, until well into the 1950s, the precursor of the present Likud party claimed that the land of Israel includes also the part of former Palestine east of the Jordan, what is today the Kingdom of Jordan. And in their emblem, in their logo, the land of Israel appeared on both sides of the Jordan. Over the years, this has been put aside, and the land of Israel is supposed to include, at the very least, though, the whole territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, the Cisjordanian Palestine, excluding Transjordanian Palestine. But since 1967, added to this land of Israel was also the Syrian Golan Heights, which Israel conquered and annexed following the 1967 war. So this is a claim for the whole of the land of Israel, which is common to all Zionist parties. In any case, I know of no Zionist party that says, no, we don't claim the whole of this, we claim this and that part of it. You don't find any restriction in terms of the wholeness of the land of Israel. This is important. In principle, all Zionist parties, which is the all the Jewish parties in Israel, extend their claim to domination to the whole of Palestine. Now, what about exclusivity? The Jewish nation has exclusive, or Jewish people has exclusive right to the whole of Palestine. Well, this historically has been accepted by the quasi-totality of the Zionist movement, certainly the mainstream. There have been very small exceptional Zionist parties who were prepared to contemplate sharing the land of Palestine with its indigenous people. They were generous enough to say, yeah, I mean, we may be satisfied with binational governance of Palestine. But there was always a proviso. In this binational arrangement, Jews were supposed to be always in the majority. So, but the mainstream was never ready to contemplate, in principle, sharing the right. There were occasions, historically, where for pragmatic reason, the Zionist leadership was prepared to accept, for the time being, domination over part of Palestine. But this was always subject to the proviso that this is a purely pragmatic, provisional arrangement. In principle, the claim was to the whole of Palestine. The classical, the most telling formulation of this is a letter dated 1937 by Ben Gurion to his teenage son Amos. This letter explains Ben Gurion's position to the proposed partition of Palestine, proposed by the Peel Commission of Inquiry. The Peel Commission operated in 1936, and in 1937 it produced its report, which proposed the partition of Palestine between Jews and the indigenous people. Ben Gurion was ready to accept it, and the letter is quoted in full in my article that I put on the chat. I mean, the reference is on the chat. The title of the article is Zionism: Quest for Legitimacy. It is dated 18th September 2014. Okay, I will not quote the Ben Gurion letter in full for simply to save time. I strongly recommend that people go back to this article, which is in the Weekly Worker archive, and read the whole letter, because it is a very important document. You see, you can really decipher the real aim of Zionism when Zionist leaders talk in private. It is usually misleading to take seriously or take completely at face value their declarations in public, for obvious reasons. They are very careful what they say in public. But this is the private letter that is in the archives of David Ben Gurion. So here are some quotes for this letter. What we want is the whole and unitary land to be Jewish. Okay? That echoes the basic guideline that I quoted from the President Netanyahu government. My assumption is, which is why I am a fervent proponent of a state, even though it is now linked into partition, that a Jewish state is on only part of the land, is not the end, but the beginning. In other words, for the moment, I'm ready to accept a part of Palestine, but always with the view that this is only a step towards getting control of the whole of Palestine. And then he ends up by saying, we should organize a superb, that is to say, in this state that is offered on the part of Palestine, we shall organize a superb defense force, a first-rate army. I have no doubt our army will be among the best in the world. And then I am confident that it will not be beyond us to settle in the remaining parts of the country, either by mutual agreement and understanding with our Arab neighbors or by other means. And you can work out what the other means are supposed to be. So here you have a very clear formulation of the claim of the main Zionist leader of the time to the whole of Palestine, undivided and totally under Jewish domination. A Jewish state in the whole of Palestine means, at the very least, a Jewish majority in the land. It means in practice also Jewish supremacy, but at the very least, it means a secure and safe Jewish majority, safe in terms that it's not a marginal majority, but a considerable majority, overwhelming majority of Jews in the whole land of Palestine. Now, the conflict between Zionism and the Palestinians has been going on, in fact, for over 120 years. And it seems to be nowhere near a resolution. I want to explain why is this. The reason for this is not difficult to see. Zionist colonization involves two anomalies, which I want to explain. There is a dishonest way of representing the conflict in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians as a clash of two nationalisms. That is to say, we have a symmetric situation where you have two national groups, each fired by its nationalist ideology, fighting over the same piece of turf. This is, of course, a travesty, a distortion of the real nature of the conflict. I hardly need to tell you that the essence of the conflict is it's being a colonial conflict. It is a conflict between colonizers and colonized. The Zionist state of Israel is a settler state which has been colonizing, or the Zionist movement, and later embodied in the state of Israel, has been colonizing the land of Palestine. However, the fact that it is possible to mislead some people and present the conflict as a clash of two nationalism is because very exceptionally, and this is a notable fact, that this colonial conflict has a surface appearance of a clash between two nations or two national groups. This is exceptional in the whole, as far as I know, in the whole history of modern colonial conflicts. What is exceptional is that we have single national groups on both sides. The colonizers have crystallized as a single national entity, a single nation, a new nation of colonizers, and also the colonized have crystallized as a single national group. Now, it is not unusual for the settlers to form a new settler nation. This has occurred everywhere where the colonization was not based on exploiting the labor power of the indigenous people, but was based on the work of the production activity of settlers themselves, such as in North America, in Australia, in New Zealand, and so on. In all such places, the settlers have crystallized as a new settler nation. But what is unusual, exceptional, is that in such places where the settlers do not rely on the labor power of the indigenous people, also the indigenous people has crystallized as a single nation. This has occurred nowhere as far as I know, in exclusionary colonization. Of course, you have situations where the colonizers do form a single nation, but this is always in places where the colonizers are either a foreign power or a small group of exploitative colonizers. Okay, but a situation where both sides have crystallized as single nations is unusual. This is one singularity. Associated with this singularity is a demographic exceptionalism of Zionist colonization. Now, again, in places which were very common in Africa, where and elsewhere in Asia, where the colonization relied on exploitation of the labor power of the indigenous people, colonizers have remained a relatively small minority. The majority of the people were the indigenous people themselves. Conversely, in a situation other than in Palestine, where the colonizers excluded the indigenous people and relied on their own labor power, the indigenous people have been overwhelmed numerically. I mean, look at Australia, look at North America, look at other places, especially in the Anglosphere, where you have colonization which excluded the indigenous people, either by exterminating them or by ethnically cleansing them in other ways. The Zionist colonization is unique in resulting, at least for the time being, in a situation where there is more or less a numerical parity between the settler nation and the indigenous national group. This is unusual. It is also basically unstable. It means that the colonial conflict has not been resolved. It is still a live issue. Who is going to win in this conflict? In the case of colonial situations where the settlers were there to exploit indigenous labor power, the second half of the 20th century witnessed decolonization. The settlers were either expelled or were deprived of their supremacy. The last case of this form, of this nature, was in South Africa. In cases where, like in Palestine, but other than in Palestine, the settlers relied on their own labor power and did not base their economy on exploiting indigenous labor, the indigenous people were numerically, demographically overwhelmed. Look at North America. In the case of Palestine, we see an unusual situation where there is, at the moment, and in fact, since 1967, sort of more or less numerical parity. Actually, the colonizers, the settler nation is in a demographic numerical minority. There are more Palestinian Arabs than Israeli Jews in the land dominated by the Zionist regime. There was a period, that is to say, the period between 1949 and 1967, when Zionism managed to hold not the whole of the land of Israel, but only 72% of it, and had a considerable majority, a very, very secure, safe majority, overwhelming majority. And this was achieved by the ethnic cleansing that took place in the 1948-49 war. In 1967, the state of Israel managed to conquer the rest of the land of Israel, Palestine, plus various other territories, including the Syrian Golan Heights. And the Zionist leaders were faced with a dilemma. Shall we be satisfied with the majority of the land that we control, the 72% of the land of Palestine, where we have an overwhelming Jewish majority, or extend our colonization to the rest of Palestine, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, where there is an intensive, a very dense Palestinian population, and then lose the advantage of a Jewish majority. This was the dilemma. As we all know, in the end, the decision was to keep the newly won territories and to start colonizing them and push the problem of Jewish majority to the future. And this is where we are stuck now. But the fact that they decided in this direction was not accidental. That is to say, it wasn't a decision on the spur of the moment, oh, what shall we do? We know that in the Israeli cabinet of 1967, headed by Levi Eshkol as prime minister, there were discussions. What shall we do with all these Arabs? Where shall we send them? They decided to keep these Arabs for the time being. Let's deal with it later on, but extend our domination to the newly won territories. In fact, in the Golan Heights, they did manage to ethnically cleanse the most of the population, leaving only the Druze minority there, and colonization has proceeded since 1967, more or less, and you don't hear about problems in the Golan Heights, more or less. There is no demographic problem. The settlers are feeling secure. The indigenous most of the indigenous Syrian people have been ethnically cleansed there. About 200,000 people, according to some estimates. Now, why am I saying that this decision to keep the occupied territories of the West Bank mainly, rather than agree to the creation of a Palestinian state? By the way, Israel never really accepted the creation of a Palestinian state. This was always a deception. They were always determined to colonize the newly won territories and deal with the demographic problems in the future as things might turn. Why were they prepared to, why did they take this decision? First of all, because they were able to. The balance of forces allowed Israel to keep the occupied territories which were conquered in 1967 without any serious international pressure to the contrary. But also because this was something for which they were ideologically and politically prepared. It is very interesting to look at discussions that took place about the problem whether to extend the borders of Israel discussions that took place 4 years before the June War of 1967. I'm talking about discussions that took place in 1963. They were quoted in the Israeli press. This is quoted in my article, Israel and the Messiah's Ass, which dates from the 1st of June 2017. It's in the Weekly Worker. I'm referring to a dialogue that took place in the Israeli press between various leaders. Okay. I'm referring to a sort of survey that took place in the Israeli press, in the newspaper Ma'ariv, actually, reported on January 31st, 1964. The survey was conducted by Geula Cohen, who self-describes as a former terrorist. In her autobiography, she refers to herself as a former terrorist. She interviewed various Israeli leaders about the then existing border of Israel, which had in fact never been finalized and were merely armistice lines established in 1949, whether these borders fall short of the entire homeland claimed by Zionism. So some people accepted that these borders were an inevitable compromise, and others were not so resigned to this reality. For example, Shimon Peres opined that Israel can exist even within the present borders. But significantly, Moshe Dayan asserted that the present borders are an outcome of the 1948 war, not an achievement of our objective. Dayan was then a member of the Labour Party. Aryeh Ben Eliezer, a leader of the party Herut, that was forerunner of the Likud, was even more explicit. Israel's existence depends on not giving up the entire country. A few months later, Yigal Allon, another general, leading general in the 1948 war, wrote the following: "The country has remained divided and its borders distorted not due to lack of correct strategic planning or lack of military capability, but only because of political restraint, for which Prime Minister and Defense Minister David Ben Gurion was responsible. Indeed, when he ordered our army to halt, we were at the peak of our victories in all decisive fronts, from the Litani River in the north to the heart of the Sinai Desert in the southwest. With just a few days of fighting, it would have been possible to achieve the final defeat of the invading Arab armies and liberate the country in its entirety." Now, significantly, both Dayan and Allon were members of the Israeli cabinet in 1967. And these people and many others like them, and of course, so was the Herut party, that is a forerunner of the Likud. So the Israeli cabinet was dominated by people who, since the war of 1948-49, believed that the liberation of the whole of the homeland, homeland claimed by Zionism, is incomplete and is waiting to be completed. So it is not surprising that this cabinet, in practice, decided to keep the occupied territories and colonize them. What to do with the dense Palestinian population, which of course has grown since then, I mean, the population of Israel in 1967, if I'm not mistaken, was under 3 million. The West Bank and Gaza had 1.5 million or 2 million inhabitants. So I may be mistaken, but you can look at the figures in the appropriate sources. But since then, the population on both sides grew. We have now a position where you have between the Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, you have about, roughly speaking, 7 million Israeli Jews and about 7 million plus Palestinian Arabs. This is, as far as the whole history of colonization in modern times shows, an unstable and untenable situation. It results in a position where the settlers cannot be secured without imposing draconic apartheid oppressive regime on the colonized, and the colonized cannot accept it. Obviously, this is a situation that you have on the one side a Zionist state which has overwhelming force, but not enough to subdue the Palestinian people and to prevent resistance. The Palestinians are able to mount acts of resistance, which Israel and the Israeli Jews regard as terror, of course. Attacks on their very existence, but which are in fact not sufficient to undermine the existence of Israel. Israel reacts in a way that is almost calculated to provoke and elicit more resistance. Let me give you just a single example. One of the measures that Israel takes in response to what it calls terrorist attacks, and terrorist attacks include all acts of resistance, whether they are aimed at Israeli civilians or at Israeli military personnel. The perpetrator, in most of these cases, is actually killed on the spot, or if not killed on the spot, is imprisoned for a long term. But then the house of his, and it's usually him, the house where his family lives is destroyed. That means that the whole family, which may number a dozen or more individuals, including children and so on, is made homeless. This is a sadistic measure, which is, of course, against international law. It is, in fact, a war crime because it is a collective punishment directed against innocent people. By the way, we have to thank the British for this measure because it is inherited by Israel from the emergency regulations of a British mandate in Palestine that ended in 1948, but which Israel took over and copied. So this sadistic measure is simply copied by Israel from British colonialism. These and similar measures are, of course, justified by these and accepted by the Israeli Supreme Court as necessary for deterrence. It is supposed to deter people from committing acts of terror. And as I said, terror means any act of resistance. I think every rational person will understand that that such measures are are provocative. Not only do they not deter, but on balance, they actually provoke further acts of resistance. People whose family home was destroyed for no fault of their own, for which I mean, not as a result of what they themselves did, but what some member of their family did, are likely to be motivated for desperate acts of resistance. So what we have is, on the one hand, desperate acts of resistance, which are not sufficient because of the balance of forces, not sufficient to liberate the Palestinian people. And dialectically, these acts of resistance are responded to by the Israeli colonial administration, that the Israeli colonial rulers, to in the way of exacting sadistic, cruel, and barbaric punishment against the population, against the indigenous Palestinian people, which in turn provokes further acts of resistance. So we have a sort of impasse. This is an escalating conflict without resolution. And what we have here foreshadowed now by the present new government coalition is a further escalation of this conflict, further inhuman, barbaric, and sadistic measures will be enacted and practiced. And the escalation will go on. Where is this leading? Well, there are two possible outcomes. This dialectic of repression and resistance can continue for the foreseeable future, or they can lead to a resolution, quote unquote, by another major ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. Plans for this kind of resolution certainly exist. We know of such plan. One of them is the Sharon plan associated with the late Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. This was published, by the way, it was published in 2002 in the Sunday Telegraph. You can find it. It consisted in ethnically cleansing millions of Palestinians from the West Bank across the Jordan, and overthrowing the Hashemite regime in Jordan and turning it into a new Palestine. That is one plan. We know that such plans exist. Whether they can be implemented depends on the international and regional situation. So this is where we are. Sorry. So this is where we are stuck now. And one thing is sure, the situation is going to exacerbate and lead to further horrors, further bloodshed, and further atrocities. I'm sorry that I cannot be more optimistic.